What would you do if your HOA suddenly decided your driveway wasn't good enough and demanded you block it off, on your own property? That's exactly what happened to me on an otherwise quiet Monday morning. I had just finished my coffee, ready to head out for some errands, when I stepped outside and saw them, 2 HOA workers standing at the end of my driveway, clipboards in hand, looking far too smug for my liking. They weren't neighbors stopping by for a chat. No, these guys had the distinct air of people who enjoyed enforcing pointless rules. One of them, a tall, overly confident man named Brad Simmons, grinned like he had just won the lottery. The other, a quieter guy named Dave Harper, scribbled something on his clipboard like he was recording the crime of the century. "Good morning, Mr. Walker," Brad said, his tone just a little too cheerful. I narrowed my eyes. "What's going on?" Brad cleared his throat, glancing at my driveway like it personally offended him. "We're here to inform you that your driveway is not compliant with HOA regulations. We've received concerns about its construction and potential safety hazards." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. "My driveway? The one that's been here for years?" Brad nodded like a school principal handing out detention. "Yes, sir. Effective immediately, you'll need to block off this portion of your driveway and relocate your parking. A barrier will need to be installed to ensure compliance with the community's aesthetic standards." I blinked. Twice. "You want me to block off my own driveway?" "That's correct." I looked at Dave, hoping for a sign that this was some kind of elaborate joke. But he just kept writing, avoiding eye contact like he knew how ridiculous this sounded but was too much of a coward to say anything. I let out a sharp laugh. "You're out of your mind. My driveway works just fine. There's nothing wrong with it." Brad's smirk deepened. "Well, Mr. Walker, the HOA has full jurisdiction over all properties within our boundaries, including driveways. This decision has already been approved by the board, so I suggest you comply to avoid further issues." My fists clenched. I had heard stories about HOAs pulling this kind of nonsense, but I never thought I'd be their next target. I could already tell what they expected, me to roll over, argue for a bit, and then give in like every other homeowner they'd pushed around. But they had picked the wrong guy. "You know what?" I said, voice calm but firm. "If you want to block off my driveway, that's fine." Brad and Dave exchanged a smug look, thinking they had won. "But I guarantee you," I continued, stepping back toward my house, "you're going to regret it." I turned and walked inside, my mind already spinning with ideas. If they wanted to dictate what I did on my own land, I was going to show them what real compliance looked like. The next few days passed in a quiet, simmering rage. Every time I looked at my driveway, I imagined Brad's smug face telling me I needed to comply with the HOA's ridiculous demand. They thought they had me cornered, that I'd grumble, maybe push back a little, and then eventually cave like every other homeowner they had bullied into submission. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't the type to give in, I was the type to fight back in a way they never saw coming. So I got to work. I didn't just block off my driveway. I transformed it. If they wanted a barrier, I was going to give them one. Over the next few days, I built a massive, fully engineered ramp leading from my garage straight to the street. And I wasn't just talking about a couple of planks thrown together in defiance, I went all out. Reinforced wood, steel supports, and a professional-grade incline that made parking easier than ever. By the time I was done, my driveway wasn't just a driveway anymore. It was a statement. When the HOA workers arrived later that week, expecting to see a nice, compliant barrier, the look on their faces was priceless. Brad's smirk disappeared instantly as he stared up at the ramp, his jaw tightening. Dave looked from the clipboard to the structure and back again, clearly unsure how to process what he was seeing. This isn't what we meant," Brad finally sputtered, gesturing wildly at the ramp. I leaned against the railing at the top, arms crossed. "Oh? You said I needed to block off my driveway. Well, I built a ramp. Now it's easier to park. Safer, even. Brad's face turned red. You were supposed to install a barrier, not this. Where in the HOA regulations does it say I can't have a ramp? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Dave hesitated. He knew they didn't have an argument. This is against HOA guidelines, Brad snapped, grasping at straws. No, this is what happens when you try to mess with someone's property. I patted the railing. I followed every rule. I'm still parking in my designated area. In fact, maybe the whole neighborhood should get ramps. Might improve things around here. Brad opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly seething but unable to argue. They left soon after, muttering under their breath, but I knew this wasn't over. A few days later, I found out just how far the HOA was willing to go. A letter arrived, but not the usual kind. This one wasn't just a warning or a polite notice about community standards. No, this was a bill for $5,000 in fines. According to the HOA, I had been receiving daily fines for my non-compliant structure. Except I had never been notified. They had intentionally withheld the notices, letting the fines pile up so they could blindside me with an unpayable amount. I stormed into the HOA office that afternoon, slamming the letter down on the counter. Nancy Caldwell, one of the board representatives, barely glanced up from her desk. I assume you're here about your fines, she said, her voice oozing fake politeness. You think? I shot back. You've been fining me every day without telling me? That's fraud. She smiled, cold and calculated. Mr. Walker, it is not the HOA's responsibility to ensure homeowners keep track of their own violations. We assumed you were aware of the fines. I clenched my jaw. You and I both know that's a load of crap. Nancy folded her hands. The total amount is now overdue. If it is not paid, the HOA reserves the right to take further action, including legal proceedings. I stared at her, feeling my blood pressure rise. They wanted to drown me in legal fees. Fine. If they wanted a legal fight, I was more than happy to give them one. I walked out and called my lawyer. But before I could even begin the process of disputing the fines, the HOA took things even further. That weekend, I left town for 2 days to visit my brother. I hadn't been gone 10 hours before my phone started ringing. It was my neighbor, Hank Lawson. You'd better get back here, Hank said, his voice sharp. There's a damn construction crew tearing your place apart. I barely registered his words before I was already throwing my bags into my truck and speeding home. By the time I got there, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. A demolition crew was actively tearing down my ramp. Pieces of wood were scattered across the driveway, workers hammering away as if they had every right to be there. And standing off to the side, clipboard in hand, was Nancy Caldwell herself, watching it all unfold with a smug little smile. I slammed my truck into park and jumped out, fury radiating off me. You'd better have a damn good reason for this, I barked, storming up to Nancy. She barely blinked. You were in violation, Mr. Walker. The HOA is within its rights to enforce removal. You forged a demolition order. Nancy's expression didn't change. My fists clenched, but before I could say anything else, a second car pulled up. Sheriff Mark Reynolds stepped out, his eyes immediately locking onto the destruction. I watched as the smug confidence drained from Nancy's face. Ms. Caldwell, the sheriff said, his voice calm but firm. You want to explain why you're ordering the demolition of private property without a court ruling? Nancy opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She knew she had screwed up. The sheriff turned to the construction workers, who were now looking extremely uncomfortable. Pack it up, boys, he said. Unless you want to be charged with criminal destruction of property. One by one, they started loading their equipment back onto their trucks. Nancy was pale, her jaw tight. "This isn't over," she snapped at me. I smirked. "I think it is." She left in a hurry, but I knew she was already thinking about her next move. And I was going to be ready for it. The moment the last of the construction workers packed up and drove off, I knew one thing for certain: Nancy Caldwell wasn't done. The HOA had already tried fining me into submission, then attempted to destroy my property while I was away. And now that their latest stunt had been shut down by the sheriff, I could only imagine what they'd try next. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The very next morning, another letter arrived in my mailbox. At first glance, I expected another list of bogus fines, but when I tore it open, my stomach twisted. This one wasn't just a fine, it was a final notice. According to the HOA, my unpaid balance had now reached over $10,000, and because I had failed to resolve the issue, they were initiating foreclosure proceedings on my home. I stared at the letter, gripping it so tightly that the paper crumpled in my hands. Foreclosure? Over bogus fines that I hadn't even been given notice for? They were actually trying to take my house. I stormed inside, grabbing my phone and dialing my lawyer before I could even think twice. Ethan, my lawyer, Mark Delaney, answered on the first ring, already sounding exasperated. "Tell me they didn't do what I think they did. They just filed for foreclosure." A long sigh came through the receiver. "I was afraid of that. I started digging into their records after you called last time. This isn't the first time they've pulled this kind of thing." I clenched my jaw. "You're telling me they've stolen homes before?" "They don't call it that, of course," Mark said bitterly. "They rack up false violations, bury the homeowner in legal fees, then force them into foreclosure through non-payment of assessments. It's technically legal, but only because they're betting most people won't fight back." "Well, they're about to lose that bet," I growled. "I was hoping you'd say that," Mark said. "I already drafted a cease and desist order. We're going to hit them with fraud, harassment, and unlawful foreclosure proceedings. But before I file, I need you to do one thing." I gripped the phone tighter. "What?" "Check the property records at the county office. I want to make sure they haven't already tried to sell your house." The blood drained from my face. Could they have gone that far? I didn't waste a second. I drove straight to the county records office, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the clerk barely looked up as I gave her my name and property details. "Give me a second," she muttered, flipping through her system. Seconds ticked by. Then she frowned. "That's weird," she said, squinting at the screen. "What?" My stomach twisted. "There's a transfer request on your property." She tapped a few keys. "It was filed 2 days ago. Says the home is pending sale due to HOA-initiated foreclosure." My hands curled into fists. Nancy hadn't just threatened to take my home, she had already tried to sell it out from under me. I forced myself to take a slow breath. "Who's the buyer?" The clerk pulled up the information. "It's listed under an LLC." She turned the screen so I could see. "Walker Creek Development Group." I stared at the name. It sounded generic, but something about it made my gut churn. I took a photo of the screen, thanked the clerk, and marched out. The moment I got to my truck, I called Mark back. "They already filed the sale," I said, voice tight. Mark cursed under his breath. "I figured they'd try to sell it fast, but 2 days. That's aggressive." "Buyers listed as Walker Creek Development Group," I told him. There was silence on the other end. Then Mark let out a low laugh. "Not the good kind. The kind that meant trouble. You're gonna love this," he said grimly. "Walker Creek? That's a shell company. And guess who's listed as one of the managing partners?" I didn't have to guess. Nancy Caldwell. Mark sighed. Yep. She's not just trying to foreclose on your home, she's trying to buy it herself. For a moment, all I could do was sit there, gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding with rage. This wasn't just HOA overreach. This wasn't just greedy enforcement of rules. This was a criminal scam. She's gonna regret this, I said, my voice low and steady. Mark chuckled. Good. Because I'm about to drop the biggest lawsuit of her career. By the time I got home, my plan was already forming. I installed security cameras all over my property, just in case Nancy or her enforcers tried anything else. Then I started compiling every document, every letter, and every instance of harassment. The next morning, I received a text from Mark. Filed. See you in court. Nancy wanted to steal my home, bury me in legal fees, and sell my property to herself. But she had underestimated me. She thought she could bully me into submission like she had done with so many others. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. The legal battle had just begun, but I already knew the HOA wasn't going to go down without a fight. People like Nancy Caldwell didn't accept defeat easily, they doubled down, they schemed, and they found new ways to break the rules while pretending to enforce them. I had already caught her trying to fine me into foreclosure and even worse, attempting to sell my home out from under me through a shell company she secretly controlled. But what happened next made it clear, she wasn't just corrupt, she was willing to break the law outright. I found out the hard way. It was a Sunday morning when I decided to leave town for a quick weekend trip to visit my brother. I figured I had done everything I needed, I had my lawyer filing the lawsuit, I had proof of the fraud, and my security cameras were up. I knew the HOA would keep pushing, but I never expected them to be this bold. Because the moment I left, Nancy made her move. Halfway through my drive, my phone rang. It was my neighbor, Hank Lawson. Hank was an old-school guy, retired military, and he had no patience for HOA nonsense. He had been keeping an eye on my place ever since the fines started rolling in. So when I saw his name pop up, I knew something was wrong. "You need to get back here," Hank said, his voice sharp. My stomach clenched. "What's going on?" "They brought in a damn demolition crew." I nearly swerved off the road. "They're tearing down your ramp as we speak," Hank continued. "Showed up with some papers, claiming they had an emergency removal order." "What?" I nearly shouted. "That's illegal. They can't." "They don't care," Hank cut me off. "They've already started. You better get here fast." I didn't even answer. I turned my truck around and floored it. By the time I pulled into my driveway, rage was boiling in my veins. A crew of workers was in the middle of dismantling my ramp. Pieces of wood and steel were scattered across the driveway, and a construction foreman stood to the side, clipboard in hand, barking orders. And standing beside him, watching it all unfold with that same smug expression she always wore, was Nancy Caldwell. I barely had the truck in park before I jumped out, marching straight toward her. "You better have a damn good reason for this," I barked. Nancy barely flinched. "Mr. Walker, your structure was non-compliant, and the HOA has the authority to enforce removals as necessary." I let out a sharp laugh. "You forged an emergency demolition order, didn't you?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. She had thought she could get away with it. Before I could say another word, a second car rolled up fast, tires kicking up dust as it came to a stop. Sheriff Mark Reynolds stepped out, his gaze instantly locking onto the destruction. The second Nancy saw him, her confidence wavered. "Ms. Caldwell," the sheriff said, his voice calm but firm. "You want to explain why you're ordering the destruction of private property without a court order?" Nancy straightened, regaining some of her fake composure. We have the authority to." "You have no such authority," the sheriff cut her off. The only entity that can approve the removal of structures like this is the county. And unless you have a court-stamped approval, what you're doing here is criminal destruction of property." For the first time, Nancy looked nervous. The construction foreman, who up until now had been blindly following orders, glanced between Nancy and the sheriff, clearly realizing he had just stepped into a legal mess. "You got a permit for this job?" the sheriff asked him. The foreman hesitated. Ms. Caldwell provided the paperwork. The sheriff extended his hand. "Let me see it." Nancy took a slow step back, but it was already over. The moment the sheriff skimmed through the documents, his expression darkened. "This is fake," he said simply, tossing the paper aside. "Shut it down. Right now." The workers, who just minutes ago had been tearing apart my property, suddenly looked very eager to leave. Within minutes, the crew was packing up their tools, shoving equipment back into their trucks. Nancy, still standing there, was fuming, but she knew she couldn't argue her way out of this one. The sheriff turned back to me. "You want to press charges?" Nancy's smug expression finally cracked. "Press charges?" she scoffed. "That's ridiculous." The sheriff didn't even acknowledge her. He kept his gaze on me, waiting. I exhaled slowly, considering it. Oh, I wanted to see Nancy in cuffs more than anything, but I had bigger plans. I shook my head. Not yet. Nancy's relief was short-lived. "I've got a lawsuit against the HOA that's already been filed," I continued. "And now I have even more evidence that they're committing fraud. I'm not just going to press charges, I'm going to bury them." For the first time since this all started, Nancy Caldwell looked genuinely afraid. The sheriff nodded. "Fair enough. But if they so much as set foot on your property again, call me." I met Nancy's glare with a smirk. "Oh, don't worry. If she tries anything else, I'll make sure she regrets it." With that, the sheriff turned, motioning for his deputies to clear the area. The last of the workers sped off in their trucks, leaving behind a half-destroyed ramp and a whole lot of bad blood. Nancy didn't say a word as she got into her car and drove off. But I wasn't stupid. I knew she wasn't finished. People like her never stopped until they were forced to. And I was going to make damn sure this was the last time she ever messed with me. I thought I had seen the worst of the HOA's corruption, but Nancy Caldwell had one final trick up her sleeve, one so outrageous that, even after everything, it still managed to shock me. A few days after the illegal demolition attempt, I received a certified letter from a real estate agency. At first, I assumed it was just another empty threat from the HOA, but when I opened it, my stomach twisted. "Congratulations on the sale of your home." I froze, reading the words over and over again as if they would change. The letter went on to confirm the pending sale of my property, allegedly initiated by me and approved by the HOA. They had tried to sell my house behind my back. Rage like I had never felt before surged through me. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This wasn't about fines or harassment or bogus HOA rules. This was outright theft. I didn't even waste time calling Nancy. I drove straight to the real estate office, slammed the letter onto the agent's desk, and demanded to know what the hell was going on. The agent, a young guy who clearly had no idea what mess he had walked into, looked at the paperwork and frowned. "The HOA provided documentation that your home was being foreclosed for non-payment of assessments," he said hesitantly. "They told us you had abandoned the property, and we were handling the resale." Abandoned? They had literally tried to bulldoze part of my property last week. I leaned in. "Listen to me very carefully. I never abandoned my home, and I never agreed to sell it. What the HOA is doing is fraud, and if you go through with this sale, you're complicit." The agent paled, clearly realizing he had stepped into a lawsuit waiting to happen. I'll have to talk to my supervisor." "You do that," I said, voice low. "And while you're at it, tell them to expect a cease and desist order by the end of the day. That afternoon, my lawyer, Mark, wasted no time filing a massive lawsuit: fraud, harassment, property theft, the works. The moment the lawsuit was made public, the buyer backed out immediately. But the damage was done. The HOA had exposed themselves. The case moved fast. Too fast for Nancy and her board to cover their tracks. Their fake fines, their illegal demolition order, and now their fraudulent sale attempt were all dragged into the spotlight. Within weeks, the fallout was brutal. Nancy Caldwell resigned in disgrace. Several board members followed. The HOA was hit with a six-figure lawsuit settlement, and after an independent audit revealed years of corruption, they were forced to dissolve entirely. The HOA was gone. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was free. I stood on my porch, watching as the old HOA office was shut down for good. My ramp, now fully rebuilt and reinforced even stronger than before, stood tall, a monument to everything I had fought for. A few days later, I saw one of the former board members driving past my house. He slowed down as he reached my ramp, staring at it like it was a giant middle finger made just for him. I smiled, gave him a small wave, and watched as he sped off without a word. Some battles aren't just about winning. Sometimes, they're about sending a message. So, have you ever fought back against an HOA? Did you win? Or did they try to destroy you, too? Share your story. I'd love to see who had it worse.